All right, I was just getting ready to confess, and then the battery died, so now I have to go back to my confession. Here's my confession. I write my sermons on Thursdays, and I do that for a variety of reasons. It's a discipline, and so I wrote the sermon for today on Thursday. Thursday night, I went down to Morgan Park to a Pentecostal church to be part of an event sponsored by Live Free Illinois. And the title of the event was The Social Justice Pastor and Organizing the Church. And there were a panel of 4 very well-known pastors in Chicago, and Reverend Sarah Bates Chamberlain, the moderator of the panel, who was asking them questions. And I was the only white pastor there that night, though there might have been some online. I went down with my friend Rabbi Seth Limmer, who is also white. He was certainly the only rabbi and the only white rabbi in the place that night. And I should say white pastor of a primarily white congregation. Let me give that caveat, because Reverend Michael Flager was one of the people on the panel from St. Sabina Community. I sat and listened to that and realized that the sermon I had just written on renewal was not quite going to be the right sermon. And I wasn't sure why. And part of it was I really struggled on Thursday writing the sermon because I understand what it means to be tired. I understand what it means to be overwhelmed. I understand even what it means to be completely drained of all energy. I have experienced all of those things like all of you have at one time or another. I know the feeling of exhaustion, and so I also know firsthand the need for renewal. And what I heard on Thursday night that started causing this upset in me is that over time, what has happened is that people are leaving the church because the church is irrelevant. And that instead, these social justice movements have gained in numbers and gained in force. And as that has happened, which has been a very good thing, churches have not figured out how to join in these movements and be a part of these movements. And so the church has really just become, another kind of club, while the justice work is being done elsewhere. And so they were even saying things on Thursday night like, if your church doesn't have a justice committee or a social justice committee, you're probably not about the right things. So, somebody like me can sit back and say, oh, we have a great justice committee. We're doing great. But then one of the pastors that night said this: the church has been about 3 things. There are 3 kinds of churches: containment, entertainment, and liberation. And you need to figure out which church yours is. Are you containing? Are you trying to tell everybody what their behavior is supposed to be? Are you entertaining? Are you just, funny and you make people feel good so that when they walk out, they can feel better about the week that's coming up ahead? Or you produce some produce these productions every single Sunday that are quite incredible. Or are you about liberation? And renewal has something to do with liberation. And so, again, I can sit there and think, I think we're about liberation. But I also know that we are a congregation that is primarily white. And the conversation that happens around renewal is different in white churches than it is in every other church. And I think I'm supposed to highlight some of those differences today. And then I am going to say something. I mean, I worked hard on this sermon, so I am going to go back and pick out a couple of things from the sermon. But here's the thing. We forget that people's lives depend on the liberation and the justice we're fighting for. And we forget that because we don't all have all of those relationships in our lives. We come to church on Sunday, and we might have 2 or 3 black people sitting in the congregation. We have Bernard, who is an elder, with us. And then when we go out from here, we forget that close relationship. And so in white churches, we talk a lot about energy, we talk about boundaries, we talk about not taking on too much, we talk about how the work you're doing should bring you joy. We talk about, as Rob said, what our offering is. What is our offering in the coming week? We talk about how we need to get away, and so we go on vacations, and we go take a week or 2 away. And those are all good things. Every single one of those things that I just talked about are good things. And what I heard on Thursday night is that we can't stop. We can be tired, we can be overwhelmed, we can be exhausted, we can be in need of renewal. And we can't stop. We are part of a community. We are part of a coalition. We are part of a march that has been going on for a long time. And we don't have the luxury of at some point getting out of the line because we're too tired or we've taken on too much. We can pause. We can get a chair and sit in that chair for a while. We can say to our neighbor, I am not doing so well. Can you hold my arm as we walk? Can you make sure I don't stumble right now? Or even, I need to go sleep for 24 hours and I will be back. Or a week, if a week is what you need. But we cannot stop. And so how does renewal happen when we cannot stop our fight for justice? And it's confusing, and I don't have all the answers. But I have a couple things to say. And again, I'm saying it from this place of, while we're renewing ourselves, people are dying. And that's a fact, and it doesn't mean we still don't need to be renewed. So how do we hold all of that together? So I'm going to say a couple things here. The Isaiah text that Nayang read is one of the more familiar texts from the prophet Isaiah, due in part to the beautiful imagery of flying on wings like eagles. Do you like my eagle photo? That was from the Fox River this summer. I thought it would be a good visual for you. And the imagery of running and not being tired, or walking and not fainting. A lot of us have learned songs that have the imagery of eagle's wings in it, and we can hum those songs. There is something about this text in Isaiah that is compelling for us. The prophet wrote it to the community of Israel in exile. That was a bad time. the Israelites believed they had been abandoned by God. The prophet, in response, is trying to do a comparison of the people and God. And so the prophet describes Yahweh as having glorious splendor and power as the creator and giver of life. It's worded almost like a poem, trying to claim the opposite of what the exiles were feeling. You think God is a schmuck and has abandoned you? Well, let me tell you about this God. The prophet wanted to give them hope and to remind them of Yahweh's never-ending, never-tiring faithfulness. The God whom you think has abandoned you never grows weary or tired. So while the politics of their situation seem hopeless to the Israelites, the prophet makes the claim that God is up to the job. The God who never faints is able to minister to the creatures who are fainting. The God who never gets weary is able to give strength to the weary creatures. The contrast between God and humanity is huge. The exiles are tired, weary, faint, powerless. And Yahweh, their God, is none of those. The best and only hope of the exiles is to stay close to God, who can do for them and give to them what is needed. The exiles who are out of energy are instructed to wait on God. To wait on God means to hope and expect, to stay silent, to give God the reins so that God can lead them to a liberating future. To wait for God is an exercise in both faith and hope. The promise given is that those who indeed hope in God will have their strength renewed and their energy restored so they can fly and run and walk. And doesn't that sound like liberation? But seriously, how does it actually work? Fly. You're going to mount up with wings like an eagle and fly. You're going to run and not be weary, and walk and not faint. How does that actually work? That you hope in God and your own strength is renewed. How does that work? How does that work for you? How does it work for me, or does it? It's one of those things that we can say so easily. And when I hear it, I just think, seriously, what does that mean? It's a great promise, but what does it mean in reality? And we're not exiles. Let's just be clear about that. But we can certainly share that experience of being at the utter end of our rope and feeling as though God is nowhere in sight or sound or feel. There are a couple of things that I think can help us with renewal. And one of those things is something that we learned as a congregation several years ago when we did a workshop on nonviolent communication. One of the keys to being able to be a nonviolent communicator, which is to speak up for what you need, one of the keys in doing that is to identify your unmet needs. Unmet needs. I'm not very good at that. I don't know if you are. I have a very difficult time telling the difference between, am I lonely? Am I tired? Or am I hungry? You would think one of those at least would be obvious. It's not for me. I have to stop and concentrate so hard to think, in this moment, what am I feeling? And sometimes it's none of those three, but I'm just saying it's not always easy to identify an unmet need. When you find yourself in conflict with the person you live with one of your friends, with your family, stop yourself for a minute before you start spinning. This is good advice right before we're about to spend time with family. And ask yourself, what is my unmet need? Often it's tired or lonely or hungry. Some of you are better at identifying hunger than others. And if you grew up in a family like mine, I was not geared toward or taught how to consider my own needs. I don't always know my needs. And so it takes great concentration for me. And sometimes renewal only comes about when I've been willing to take the time to identify my unmet need. When I make a statement, which I have to confess that I did in the last month, when I say, I am done with all of humanity, that's a signal to me that I should take a minute and think about what is my unmet need. Why am I just suddenly done with all of humanity? There's a reason for that. There are things that are going on. So if we can identify our unmet needs, that goes a long way toward renewal. The other key, though, and it's at the heart of the Isaiah text, and it is what it means to wait on God. I could be funny about that. If I were a cartoonist, I could draw some very funny things about what it means to wait on God. But I do think there's also a very practical part of this. One step to waiting on God is to look and listen. When my kids were in elementary school, I would go pick them up after school, and I would just look at every single kid coming out of the school until I would see one of their faces. And then automatically a smile would come as I would glimpse them. Part of what it means to wait for God is to look all around you constantly. There are signs. There are ways that God is at work in the world, even though you may not feel it at all in your life. It takes looking. It takes putting our heads up from whatever it is that we are looking at like this. Look around you. Look at people, look at animals, look at the trees, look at creation, look at whatever you need to look at. But God is very active in the world if you will look. And the other part of that is to listen. Part of what it means to wait on God is to listen. What are you hearing? And it's not always going to be directly to you. It can sometimes be through somebody. If you need Jesus, you might like my church. That takes listening. So what are you listening to? What are you listening for? What are we all listening to and for? Part of how renewal happens is that we look and we listen, and when we do that, we will see God and we will hear God. And another part of that is to hope. And this is a really tough one for me. The idea of hope, I mean, I get hope in the general sense, but when it comes to God, what exactly is it I am hoping God will do? I grew up hoping that my alcoholic mother would get sober, and she never did. So I have a complicated relationship with hope. But I believe what the prophet Isaiah says, that if we will hope in God, our strength will be renewed. And that is one of the things that happened on Thursday night. Because what each one of those pastors said about the social justice church and organizing the church and being a social justice pastor is that it is never one person, one church, one community, one organization, never. It is groups of people coming together to do the thing. And if we're lacking in hope, if we've lost hope, it's probably because we think it's up to us. We've somehow made it about us and what we're doing. But what happens when we come together is the hope is in the community part. When you start listening to people who have been a part of justice movements for decades, I listened to 4 of them on Thursday night. You know what the key is, the secret in that? There is a secret sauce. The secret sauce is that the people you are doing it with, that's all the hope you need. I mean, the people are where the joy is. The people are where the hope is. The people are where the energy is. It's not when I come to church and sit in my office and try to do certain things. That's not super exciting. It's not necessarily what gives me hope, the work I do in private. What gives me hope is every time I gather with people who are committed and clear and who have faith in God, even at times when I might not. My faith, we've talked about this before, sometimes goes up and down. And that's the point of community. Because as a community, faith is so strong. Rob's faith this morning, that gives me hope. Because I heard loudly and clearly, it is not an easy path. It has not been an easy path, Rob. But even in the midst of that, to claim faith in God, to claim hope, that God is co-partners with us, we are co-responsible with God. That gives us hope. That renews our strength. If you're on the verge of being burned out, then something needs to be different. And that's what we try to say in this community is it takes all of us because sometimes people need to take a rest. Sometimes people are more or less able to give financially. And so I need to ask myself, can I give a little more in this time when I know some others might be giving a little less? The same is true with time and energy. Can I give a little more in this time? Even if I might be discouraged or I might be tired. And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. And we do not have the luxury of checking out completely. I want you to hear that. We are community together, but we are also part of a larger community, and we do not have the luxury of checking out altogether. So if renewal is something you need, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how renewal can happen for you. Because we need you. I need you. And the same is true for me. If I get to a point where I need renewal, which happens, then I need to be about that so that I can come back and we can be together again. And I don't have the luxury of checking out altogether. So, I don't know what I just said about renewal. Enough. What I know is that we are part of this incredible community of people all through Chicago, all over the country, who constantly need to be renewed and constantly need to be walking and running and flying without getting tired. So may we be about that together, and may we share it with others as well. Amen.